All right, well, hello everyone. I'm Megan Rippy, and I'm here today really to talk to you about the impact of deicers on engineered ecosystems, particularly those for urban stormwater management. All right, so why focus on deicers? The main reason I wanted to talk about this today is that many of the nation's freshwaters are salinizing. And this map is kind of illustrating that. It's from a USGS assessment of trends in specific conductance from 1992 to 2012 in 422 streams across the US. And anytime you see a little red triangle, that means specific conductance is increasing, green is decreasing, and then white is no trend. And sort of looking across this whole map, we can see that there's lots of areas where salinity is increasing, particularly along the East Coast, including Virginia, where we are today. And salinization threatens a lot of the systems that we care about. It threatens freshwater ecosystem health, agricultural productivity, the sustainability, reliability, and safety of our drinking water supplies, and also it can decrease the design lifetime of our infrastructure. And that includes traditional gray infrastructure, our pipes, our pavement, steel components of our bridges, right? But also green infrastructure elements, things we use to manage our urban stormwater runoff, our detention basins, our bioretention systems. And that's really going to be what I'm focusing on today. So green infrastructure often relies on vegetation, for many of the services it provides. These include a variety of kind of traditional and more non-traditional services, things like nutrient removal, plants are uptaking those nutrients, stormwater infiltration, plant roots help water infiltrate into soils, habitat provisioning, native plants provide very good habitat, aesthetics, we love them, and they help contribute to sense of place in our communities, among, a whole vast range, of other different types of services that are hard to see because this is a little faded here right now. Sorry about that. Unfortunately, most plant species are salt sensitive. Only 1% of the world's flora, are salt-tolerant halophytes. And this makes salinization a really credible threat to green infrastructure performance, particularly in regions that are cold climate, like Virginia, where they receive, seasonal inputs from deicers and anti-icers because we're trying to improve public safety, during winter. So we know that we have this credible threat to green infrastructure performance, but how big of a problem is it really? And unfortunately, we don't have a good handle on this right now. There's certain things that we do know. We recognize, that sodium from road salts, it actually competes with other base cations for exchange sites in soil. This is a process called ion exchange. And that facilitates a slow release of sodium, from the soils, that the plants can be impacted by throughout the growing season. So that's potentially risky. We also know that sodic soils tend to have really poor soil structure, and that adversely affects plant growth. It makes it difficult, for them to take up water, nutrients, and oxygen, things that they need. Saline soils are also a problem. Plants have salt toxicity issues, so they have, ionic and osmotic stress, and that reduces the capacity of vegetation to provide some of these key water quality services. So we have a lot of these indicators, that there might be an issue, but we have limited understanding right now of both the amount of salt that's retained in green infrastructure soils, and the level of stress that poses to established plant communities. So we really wanted to go after this issue. And we posed 3 questions to try to help and understand, what might be going on here. So the first thing that we wanted to do, is to characterize plant-available salts in green infrastructure soils, getting at the level of salt stress that they presently, experience, that sort of vegetation are experiencing. This is the how bad is it kind of question, right? Next, we wanted to survey established green infrastructure plant communities and determine the fraction that are actually salt tolerant, versus salt sensitive. So what salt tolerant species are present? How vulnerable might these systems be to this kind of problem? And the last part here, we were really interested in quantifying salt accumulation in the tissues of some of these halophyte, salt-tolerant species, trying to see whether or not the plants can actually remediate their own environment, right? Can phytoremediation actually help solve this challenge? So where were we going to do this, right? We had to pick some study sites. So we decided, sort of with help from Fairfax County and the Virginia Department of Transportation, we compiled about 1,495 stormwater detention basins, so information on all of these. And then we used a cluster analysis to kind of group everything out based on land use. And we identified, three major groupings. We have sites that primarily are draining open space, primarily draining parking lots, and primarily draining really large highways. And our goal was to, pick 5 basins at random from each of these categories. It was all going to work out beautifully. But reality intervened. We had to adjust our site selection a little bit because of accessibility concerns and, some real-world drainage issues. So in the end, we had about 4 basins that were draining really large highways, courtesy of VDOT, 6 basins draining parking lots, and then 4 that were draining more pervious open space. And they were pretty well distributed, throughout Fairfax County. These are just some images kind of illustrating what those sites look like. So at the top, we've got the VDOT detention basins. Whoops, advancing too quickly. In the middle, we have our parking lot sites. And then at the bottom, we sort of have these ones that are draining open space. Sampling at these sites occurred from fall 2021 through to fall 2022. And we timed our sample collection to capture de-icing events and their aftermath. So the first sample set was really kind of prior to winter snowfall. You can think of this as the initial condition, what we're starting out with. Then we had 3 sampling events during winter that were immediately following snow, trying to get at that maximum salt loading condition. And then we had 4 more kind of trailing into the spring and summer growing season, that time where plants are going to be maximally impacted. And each time, we were going out, we were thinking about 3 different types of samples. So we were collecting soils, we were looking at plant communities, and we were looking at plant tissues. And the soils we did year-round, every time we went out. And we were focusing on composite soil samples from the bottom of the detention basin, where the water ponds up. We had about 10 to 30 samples per composite. All the samples were air dried, we ground them, and we analyzed them for plant available salts, so that's things like sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and chloride. We also looked at electrical conductivity, and all of this was done using what's known as a saturated paste analysis, because that gets at your plant available, components. For our plant communities, this is obviously done more spring and summer when everything's green and growing. Vegetation was surveyed using what's known as the point intercept transect method. Basically, you lay transect tapes, walk the grid, and identify plants at evenly spaced points. We identified all plants at the species level when we could. We classified them as native, exotic, or invasive, and then as salt tolerant or salt sensitive. For plant tissues, this is also mostly spring, trailing into fall a little bit. Here we were looking at above ground tissues from 4 of our more common plant species that we saw across many of our sites. Dried our samples, ground them, and then analyzed them for within tissue concentrations of chloride and sodium just to see, what was being taken up by these plants. So each of these different sampling approaches was really keyed to one of our 3 questions. So our soils, we're getting at kind of how bad, is the salinization story here? What level of salt stress are plants experiencing? The plant communities are getting at what salt-tolerant species are present, and then our tissues are helping us get at that phytoremediation and whether or not it might mitigate the problem. All right. So starting with that first part, kind of the how bad is it question. Well, the answer to this question we found really depended on the primary land use that the system drained. Unsurprising, but really important to point out. And that's what this plot here is intended to show you. I want you to focus in on the different colored points. So all of the blue ones here are from our highway sites. The green ones are from sort of those sites that are draining, pervious areas. And then the tan ones are from sites draining parking lots. And what you can see here is all the blue points are shifted down and a little to the right. Close to these ion suite here, we've got sodium, we've got chloride, and we've got higher electrical conductivity. So our road sites had higher conductivity and higher sodium and chloride concentrations. See the opposite thing with those sites that are draining open space. They're shifted kind of up and left, right, away from this ion suite, and and with a little bit, potentially more potassium. So these had lower conductivity, lower sodium and chloride concentrations, and more potassium. And our parking lot sites were kind of all over the map. They were a little bit more variable. So when we're thinking about this question, how bad it is it? We really have to think about the site type and what it's draining. So how much stress are we really talking about? Looking at these different ions in the soils, does it matter to the plants? And when we're thinking about what matters to plants, it's really good to focus on the two things they care about most. That would be the soil sodicity and the soil salinity. So sodicity we express relative to the exchangeable sodium percentage, and salinity you can look at electrical conductivity. And if you're a plant, you really want to be in this not saline or sodic bin. That's kind of your happy space. And all of these little colored points here are the data from all of our different soil samples. Again, road, parking lot, and pervious. And most of the time, we found that our samples did lie in this not saline or sodic region, which is good news. It was always true for sites draining pervious areas, and it was often true for sites draining parking lots and roads. For parking lots, it was like 88 to 95% of the time, and roads, it was more 77 to 81% of the time. It's important to note, though, that we do have instances, when soils are becoming sodic, and particularly at sites draining roads. You can see there's a lot of blue points going on in here. And that occurred primarily during winter. That's what all these little W symbols mean. But you also see instances where you've got spring and summer and then trailing into fall. So there are times when these conditions persist year-round, particularly when the plants are growing, and that's not so good. In a couple of instances, very rare, we have the double whammy of sodic and saline. This was, again, rare and only during winter. It occurred at our largest site that was draining, an overpass, really big freeway. Does happen, but relatively rare. So what is the take-home message sort of from the soil information? Kind of what did we find here? First thing that I think it is important to point out is that salts are not present in green infrastructure soils at levels that are harmful to vegetation all that often, and that is good news. The sites most at risk, though, are going to be those that are draining our large highways, and that risk is primarily due to elevated soil sodicity, which adversely affects plant growth. And that means we're not home free either, because unfortunately, a lot of our desirable services, like nutrient assimilation, uptake of other pollutants, it's a function of plant growth rates. So it may still be wise to bias towards salt-tolerant plant species at sites where we've got sodicity persisting throughout the year. That means our big highway detention basins. So if we actually wanted to do this, kind of what kind of salt-tolerant species do we have available if we wanted to go back in and replant some of these systems to have this? Well, we found in our plant community analysis 279 unique species across all the green infrastructure sites, so there are a lot of different types of plants present. Unfortunately, only about 10% of those were salt-tolerant, 48 were salt-sensitive, and a large fraction here had an unknown salt tolerance. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done looking at the salt tolerance of these various plant species. Thinking on that 10% that were salt tolerant, it's important to note that less than half of them were also native. All right, so we don't have a lot of salt tolerant candidates to choose from if promoting native biodiversity is also an end goal. And often, it really is. Right? In total, we found 13 plant species that were both salt-tolerant and native. That included about 5 grass species, 4 flowering forbs, we had a vine, a shrub, and a couple of trees. So it's not a lot, but it is a place to start, right? So recognizing that we don't have a lot of salt-tolerant species to choose from, we still wanted to know if planting the ones that we've got can confer any real-world benefit in these systems. Can it help them maybe self-repair and make green infrastructure persist longer and be robust to these de-icing events? Come on, there we go. And to do this, we looked at our 4, relatively common plant species, kind of that were spread across these basins, and those included 2 of our native salt-tolerant species. We had Typha latifolia, so our cattail, also red fescue is relatively salt-tolerant, down here, a grass. We did want to look at one native rush. This one had unknown salt tolerance, but it's a common phytoremediation species, so we wanted to kind of check it out. And then because it was super prevalent, we also wanted to take a look at this nuisance weed here, Rumix crispus, also known as curly dock. Not that we're advocating planting it, but you're likely to have it whether you want it or not, so we might as well know what it does. All right, so what we found is that cattail and curly dock are actually pretty good phytoremediation species. And that's what this plot down here is attempting to show. This one's just for sodium. It's milligrams of sodium per gram of dry plant tissue. And on the bottom, we just have our pervious sites, parking lots, and roads. And then it's separated out with all the information for cattail. Then we've got curly dock. Then we've got grasses, and then we have rushes. And the thing that I want you to cue into is that the within tissue concentrations, for sodium and also chloride, even though I'm not going to show that plot here today, I'm just going to have to, you're going to have to take my word for it, that in those species, these guys here, cattail and curly dock, tend to be higher than what we see in red fescue and juncus, and so that suggests they're likely to be our better, phytoremediation plants. It is notable, though, that for all plant species, you see this, increase in concentration going from our pervious sites to these road and parking lot sites. Even in these guys that weren't great salt accumulators, they're still doing something. So all plants are good plants. They're still, phytoremediating a little bit. It's just you're getting the best you can get out of these guys up here. So plants take up salt, right? We've shown that. Is it enough to really matter? So to get at this, I wanted to do a little back-of-the-envelope calculation, and we're going to stress back-of-the-envelope here, because we don't have all of the data we need to do this perfectly. But we started with the amount of salt that is likely to have been placed on roads that drain to each of our VDOT detention basins, these more contaminated sites. And this would be estimated from recommended application guidelines for salt on roads. These are posted in the Salt Management Strategy for Northern Virginia. So you can go and look up those tables and get some, back-of-the-envelope estimate for that. And what we found is that somewhere between 500 and 3,000 kilograms of sodium, 800 to 4,500 kilograms of chloride, varying depending on the basin. It depends on the amount of lane miles that are going to that particular system. So that's the inputs. And we combine that with a quick calculation for phytoremediation potential. So we start with the within tissue salt concentration in milligrams of ion per kilogram of dry mass. You can just multiply that by the plant dry mass and by the area of the basin to get some idea of salt uptake. In this case, we focused on cattail because it's our best native, salt accumulator in a single growing season. Okay. And when you do this, the green arrows here kind of indicate, our various uptakes. And the things that it's important to cue into here are the size of these numbers. They're about an order of magnitude or two smaller than what goes into the system. So to answer this question, could these plants assimilate enough salt to really matter? Well, our best salt accumulator could remediate a maximum of 0.5 to 5% of the sodium and 0.9 to 6.1% of the chloride each basin received during winter. So the rest is going to either accumulate in the soils or it's going to be discharged to downstream water bodies. So 5 to 6% is not nothing, but it's safe to say that the majority of salt is not phytoremediated over a single winter season. I do want to put in a caveat here, though. We only looked at a single winter season, right? And the winters here are super variable. The winter we studied was particularly snowy, lots of salt application. That's not always the case. When winters are less severe, the amount of salts that plants have to process is going to be lower. That may make phytoremediation a bit more viable. All right, so just keep that in mind. It'd be better to look at this year on year to get a sense of what they can actually do. So with that, I'd kind of like to summarize and conclude. I'm going to do this by going back to each one of these questions, posing it again, and then trying to give it a brief answer. So in terms of, does salinization of green infrastructure soils pose a threat to their vegetation and the services they provide? We'll say generally no for sites that are draining pervious areas and parking lots. The detention basins, that drain highways are much more problematic. Some of them become sodic during winter and remain that way into the growing season, and that has implications for their ability to assimilate nutrients and perform other services. So we're more worried about those sites. We can plant what we want to plant in sites that are draining open space, at least according to this particular study in this area. Do green infrastructure plant communities include salt-tolerant species that might perform well under these conditions? Yeah, but not many. So about 10% of the species we identified were salt-tolerant. That was 28 species total. Of them, 13 were native. So that's something to keep in mind. It's some exploration we still need to do to get a better handle on real numbers there. Question 3, can any of these species phytoremediate salts and increase the resilience of green infrastructure to de-icing events? That one's more of a resounding maybe. All right. Cattail and curly dock show some promise, but they can only do so much. Phytoremediation is only a partial solution. It's no substitute for thinking about what we put down in the first place, for source control. So just keep that in mind. And with that, thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions if I haven't gone over.
We have plenty of time for questions. Do we have any questions?
Are you going to continue this research? And if so, do you plan on expanding that to maybe other areas that don't just use traditional road salts, but maybe how brines, something like that, would affect plant growth?
I should say that the place we were looking at used both brines and road salts. Actually, a lot of the highways are brine, to the point that when we go in the winter and have to break the ice on these systems to do sampling, you get full-on brine in the face. Our conductivity meter was over the salinity of ocean water at certain instances. So sometimes it can get really salty in these systems, and it is brine. We do have some, and I didn't present on this work today, we did some work down closer to Blacksburg, actually, as well, sort of in collaboration with one of the transportation districts down there. So we have a little bit of information on what's going on in other parts of the state, but I haven't done any work sort of outside of the state as of yet. And I'd expect it to be really different, because as soon as you start getting really persistent winters, less of this, sort of fluctuation, the story might change. We were seeing, that it accumulates. So you start out with lower salt concentrations in the fall, you have a bad winter, and it ends out higher than it was before. But we suspect that the reason that it was so low to begin with at the beginning, that pre-fall event, was just because we had really low snow winters prior to that. So if it goes back up, stays high, and then you have a series of low, snow event winters, things can go back down again. And we really don't have a good handle on that or what that looks like, in other states that have more persistent winters.
To the back I go.
You could take that study to North Dakota. They have
Yeah.
Do you plan on continuing your research to see if there is long-term accumulation of salts in the soil, and/or do you know of any results of research about whether soils are getting much saltier or sodic?
From a green infrastructure standpoint, there's not a lot of work that's looked long-term, would be what I'd say. So maybe you'd get a year, maybe you get 2 years in terms of sort of looking at winter accumulation in soils. Along roadside, though, there's been more sampling of soils just kind of like along highways, and it does appear that you're getting accumulation, and you're also getting leaching into the groundwater, for those types of systems. So it is a problem for sure, and it kind of depends on, sort of distance from the salt application to some extent.
Any other questions? Man. Did it on purpose. Made you run all the way to the back. Yeah. I wore sneakers for a reason.
Why do you think that the roads had a high, like the areas near roads had a higher salt content compared to parking lots, especially if roads are probably using more brine? Is it just like a distance thing, or do you think it's like like the amount that they're applying?
I'm guessing it's sheer amount of drainage area. It's not so much the amount of salt necessarily applied per, lane mile or, per area. That I don't have a good handle on for the parking lots anyway, so I couldn't do a direct comparison. But those VDOT detention basins have huge drainage areas, so they're receiving all, of that salt from that area. Whereas some of these parking lot systems, it might even be you've got 4 basins per parking lot, so you're only getting a small portion, from that system. And we had one parking lot site that was sort of on the bad end of things, and that one was more of a poor management thing. And we know that because when we went in to sample one of the winter sampling days, we found a partially used bag of rock salt in the system itself. So the human element, plays a huge role. That's part of the variability, in the parking lot sites. The others were cleaner because practices, are probably more standardized. The parking lots are variable for sure.
Any other questions? I have one. When you said that you were monitoring directly after a winter weather event, whatever that means, what do you define directly after as? Do you standardize that in any way, or is it just when it's safe to get out is when you're going out to do it?
We tried to do the day after when we could, but it would be sort of the day after, snow stopped falling. Sometimes it wound up being, a couple days because it could take us 2 days to get to the whole set of sites. There wasn't always access to all of them, at the same amount of time. But yeah, it was generally about a day after, and my students and I in galoshes with a big ice pick to get into the bottom of the system.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Last call for questions? Okay.
Thank